This is CUNY TV, the television station of the greatest urban university in the world.
As the sun sets at the end of a New York workday, the mind transitions from daily tasks to the cloudier, more philosophical regions of social issues, culture, and politics. In a democracy, every perspective on the world is important, and people in art and culture have surprising bodies of knowledge that can shed fresh light on today's reality. The following conversation with Anne Lindberg took place in Ackramdale, New York on January 14th, 2021.
Anne Lindberg is an artist whose work is a methodical give and take between carefully drawn straight lines and the delicate poetry of color and form. Her abstract string installations and pencil drawings activate sensations from clouds passing to birds in flight to episodes of conflict and tranquility. You have this very distinctive farm compound going on. So can you tell me how you chose this and where you're from? Because I think it relates.
I often say that this compound we have is basically a series of Monopoly pieces. So I think there's a kind of let's build something that looks like what a child would build if they were going to build a farm, or the images of a farm. But yeah, to your question about where I was raised in Iowa City, Iowa, in a university town, but of course surrounded by the rural landscape of Iowa and all the things that Iowa is.
There's a particular response to landscape, though, I find. I mean, being a Midwesterner, too, the landscape here is really open. I mean, it feels like it could be the rolling hills of northern Missouri, Iowa.
Yeah. In fact, we've been sort of teased for, we found a lot of people who live in this area want to live in the woods or live more adjacent to tree cover, but it wasn't what we wanted. We wanted open view.
I think your work is very responsive to landscape. It's abstract, it's about lots of things, but it feels to me in some ways like it's recreating certain experiences in landscape.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to say something about your reference to how the buildings are sited in the landscape, this sort of idea of prospect and refuge. The sort of tuck yourself against a hill, but have the view, this sort of basic animal sense of protection, but yet sight at some distance.
Yeah.
And those are actually all things that I think are a part of the work as well. There's a real attention to the micro, sort of internal, intimate, close sense of what's going on, and then the more sweeping, like symphonic, if you want to call it that, the sort of like the grander gestures.
Yeah. I know we're both fans of Terry Tempest Williams, and I think as an environmentalist, part of what she's trying to teach people is that if you can appreciate the subtleties of the landscape you're living in, then you'll probably want to try to preserve it in some way, or at least respect it more than most people seem to do.
Yeah, because those subtleties change on a daily basis. Her way of thinking about the world is so profound to me. In fact, her book called Refuge was really a changing experience for me to read for ways to think about work, because she tells three simultaneous stories that are seemingly unrelated, and she doesn't didactically explain their relationship, but in the compounding information of each story, one about land, one about birds, and one about family, you then end up with a lesson about environmental politics and how family relates to land, and what it means to attach yourself to a place and to believe in it and protect it and all those things.
Our lives are so intertwined with the world around us if we're just sensitive to it in some way.
Yeah.
Right? Your graduate studies in fiber from Cranbrook, I've seen you diverge from that over the years, and I'm wondering, has the field of fiber kind of gone on its own path and you've diverged from it, or do you see that you've kind of worked in parallel to certain things happening in that particular area?
I will say that when I first graduated, I was very embracing of the field and felt connected to its history. I had come out of a museum background, doing internships with collections of textiles and so on, and that experience is really the people I met and what I learned was incredible. But when I began teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute in the Foundations program, I became more sort of interested in core ideas of why we create things and ways of creating, and was less interested in a discipline-specific context for the work. So I steered away, in a way, and began to mostly see my work as a form of drawing in like all of its expanded definitions. And then, if I can just say one more thing, the the sort of DIY, the interest in craft and eBay and all this kind of return to hand making has elevated a welcome of work made with textiles in an art context.
Yeah, no, I think there's a flattening of the different disciplines. We don't see things in quite such a hierarchical way, thankfully, which I relate to multiculturalism in politics and the culture in general and all of that, I think. But can you describe how you took that step from going from fibers that seems to me like they used to reference in a lot of fiber artists' work in general, kind of feminist, like homespun kinds of women's work, but you've taken that though and put it into a kind of like installation format, which is very unique.
When I think about all the things that I've studied and things I've attached myself to over the years, I think I've always been interested in the path of a line, like the movement of a mark, however it's made, a chisel in wood for woodcut, drawing on paper, stitching in fabric, which I did a lot of in graduate school. Sort of been interested in the movement of a point from here to there. So that's a sort of general thing to say. But really the installations came about through a couple of key experiences. One was a residency at Art OMI where I had been working with thread in sort of bundling forms, like brush kinds of forms. And I was just inspired by the physical environment that I was working in and found myself holding this sort of shimmering yellow thread in the blue light of the studio and realized like, whoa, what would happen if I put this in space rather than on a surface? And what were super crude experiments became like an obsession. And how big can it be, and how can it envelop my body, and how can it be a performance in its production and all of that? They
almost form natural environments. They feel like clouds or birds in flight. Or are you surprised by how they turn out sometimes, what they do?
I'm always surprised. I mean, you can only model it and study it so much, and then there's sort of this leap of faith. The institution gives you some number of days based on what you expect it to take. And really the personality of the space, the nature of the architecture, who it is who designed it, the daylight, the electric light, the viewpoints, the stairways, like all of those things alter the way they feel. And of course I'm responding to that as I script, develop the idea in the first place. But I'm always surprised. And I make color choices and density change choices as I'm building it. So it's a live process. It isn't entirely planned. I've diagrammed it and given it a lot of thought. But
is that how the drawings are made too? You decide which color to choose for the next line. You just feel like you're going to go into a chartreuse phase in the next layer or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the drawings really come in waves. I tend to work in a collection of, like a palette for a period of time, and then the landscape changes, the responses I have to what's going on around me in politics or social space or whatever change. I mean, my recent work has a high intensity to it. It's very emotive.
Are these the ones you're calling flash drawings?
Yeah.
You've been doing those during the pandemic, more or less, right? As a kind of emotional register of what's going on?
I mean, really on a weekly basis, another drawing appears. I mean, they're really my responses to what's going on. I mean, the rise and fall of cases and the political response and so on. And somehow these flashes of color and intense shifts of contrast get at my emotional response, which is sometimes quite calm and other times quite a bit of rage or fear.
Do you look back on the drawings from 2 or 3 years ago and remember what that particular mood or feeling was?
Yeah, and especially the move from an more urban situation to a rural situation.
You're one of the most literate artists, visual artists, I know, I would say. So but you really absorb poetry and essays in a way that sort of deeply affects you, that you incorporate into the work pretty consciously.
Well, I work abstractly, as you said, and but yet obviously they're informed by the human condition or life experiences. And I found that literature, it gives me a kind of confidence. It gives me a way to find another voice for the meaning in the work, like an adjacent voice. So you're reading Dickinson on your lunch break and the line, existence has a stated width, appears before you. And you think, that's what I'm doing in my studio. You know, existence has a stated width. It's between here and there, or maybe the point of the line is it's undefined. So then that becomes the title of the work. So yeah, it's these vignettes or little bits of language that I find are like really powerful prompts that help me connect my work to something other than myself and other than itself.
I see your work as being very disciplined, and can you, even the way you behave in the studio, I think, it's not the romantic idea of the artist of being like drunk and slinging paint around and and all of that, you know, at least as far as I know, you know.
Yeah, discipline's an interesting word. I mean, to me, the work in the studio is work. I mean, it's labor. It's something you have to stick with whether you're comfortable or not. And if you just keep doing it, something will happen. I mean, I really believe you, at least, and I feel grateful to have the opportunity to be in the studio every day. If you're there, it will occur. And if you're there just looking, that's fine too. If you're there turning on the music and dancing, that's good too. But I do make labor-intensive work, although I don't really think of it as laborious. I mean, labor to me is really different than laborious. But the discipline is really the stick-with-itness, like keep at it. And some work fails and some work is successful.
No, I think what you're talking about too is patience, which is something that's been a big value for a lot of people this last 10 months with all of this going on. Some people are innately more patient, but I think for a lot of people they've had to learn how to be patient. But I think patience is something that was already in your work. It's some sense like it feels like this pandemic condition has kind of caught up with the way you look at things, and I think might even be bringing more kind of appreciation for what you're doing or how you're living or how you're working.
When I think about conversations I had with artists early on, you know, talking about not being able to go to social events, my response was, great, that's fine. You know, because I mean, my wish is always for like 4 consecutive days in the studio where my main responsibility is maybe feeding those around me, but just keeping at the work. So yeah, it hasn't, it of course it's been tragic and difficult, and I'm very aware of my own privileges to be where I am and to be able to work constantly. But yeah, patience is, in some ways in certain parts of my life I'm not so patient actually, but in the studio I just always believe that if I keep at it and keep paying attention to what's happening, that the work will come.
Anne Lindberg's solo exhibition at the Museum of Design in New York closed in March 2019. Her work is currently on view at Carrie Seacrest Gallery in Chicago. A new thread installation will be featured this fall at the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York. The following conversation with Mary Chatham took place in Roxbury, New York on January 11th, 2021.
Mary Chatham is an artist whose work in both collage and ceramics explores unusual spaces, from lush, fragmented decorative interiors impossible to occupy, to porcelain objects resembling sea creatures, odd plants, machine parts, and internal organs. You're what is thought of as a process artist, like somebody who just sort of gets busy with the materials and see what happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it probably could be almost any material. When I was, teenager, I was totally into photography, and I wasn't into the science or the craft of the print and all that. I just cared about what I saw, and then,
Yeah. I mean, porcelain seems like it requires a lot of technical skill, right? I mean, you have to know how to control it. Does that have to be the right consistency? And
I don't make my own, clay body.
Right.
Sometimes I add stuff to it and sort of see what happens. It's sort of, I feel like I'm always trying to see how I can make it kind of go wrong a little bit, there are people who, think of the Chinese porcelain, centuries
traditions
of craft and knowledge went into knowing that I'm much more. I could be working with, you know, stoneware. I love the vitreousness of it, and the, you know, when it really gets fired, you know, you can sort of see through it. And
did you do that kind of study of that tradition, and then you're kind of breaking from it, or you just got in and you're just doing?
No,
what
I
you do
just
with it?
got.
Yeah.
I was doing photography, and then I sort of started painting, and I started doing clay because I kind of felt I should stop painting with turpentine and oil when I had, you know, a small child sort of living next to my studio or whatever. And then I you know, clay to me was so much more of a sort of living material in a way, you know. That,
When I think of the objects you're making, they look to me like sea creatures or skeletons or something like that, or it could even be like some of the dried flowers here in the garden, particularly the hydrangeas over there. But I was also noticing some other things that look a little more mechanical that you've been doing, like tubes and things. And I wonder if new shapes have been coming out in the last couple of years. History has a way of like projecting other ideas onto abstract things.
I think the bigger pieces I build sort of in parts, and, you know, I'll start a piece and like, oh, I'm going to keep going with this or whatever. And I'm never quite sure how I'll end up using it. The last couple of years I've been trying to make them a little less fragile, which is sort of a problem I seem to have with most things I make, that, you know, like, okay, thread, porcelain, paper, they're
Conservator's
all hard.
nightmare. Yeah. Some of them that I've seen recently look more like organs and things, like not as, I haven't seen as many that look like flower petals or coral, but they start to have tubes and
you know, I sort of cringe when people like, and I mean, I think of much more as sort of plants, or you know, like Blossfeld he did those photographs as a teacher, a ceramic teacher or whatever. Originally I made them so you could take them apart and keep adding to them, or they would sort of go infinitely. I always think of them more as kind of spatial, you know, it could be the size of a galaxy or a microscopic, you know, sort of little moment.
I could see that it has something to do with what I see in Thomas Saraceno's work, for example. Kind of like spaceship or pod living in under the sea or in outer space or something like that. They look to me almost like living spaces.
When I go down to my clay studio area, you know, I try to sort of leave my judgment or plans at the door.
I mean, you said on your website something about this Japanese word ka, which is the space in between. And I suppose architects or art historians would say interstitial spaces or something like that. But I mean, what do you see in those kinds of spaces?
I think it's just those are always the spaces I'm interested in, that sort of ambiguous space of like, is that what's coming at me, or is that going, you know, and visually, artistic, whatever, the things I'm always interested in is that caught in that ambiguity and thinking before I kind of go, no, it's that.
No, it just occurs to me that photography and this kind of clay sculpture has something in common. Both of them are arresting time in a certain way, because you're working with the fluidity of what's going on in the world or what's happening in your hands with the clay, and then at some point you stop it.
Yeah, and then so it's like frozen, and that thing or whatever is a, you know, pretty intricate recording of that between either the image or the clay.
It's like the footprint in the sand or something.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about people doing things with yarn or craft, you know, versus like fine arts. I'm feeling like those terms are less and less relevant.
I hope
lately.
so. I mean,
it seemed to me if there was this sort of spire of artistic aspiration, which was like abstract expressionist painters, and they were all white dudes, that seems to have. I'm relating it in my mind bizarrely to Flattening the Curve, where it's not so much this kind of spike of achievement that only certain people achieve in a certain way, but maybe a flattening of a flatter playing field of people doing more things in more diverse ways with different materials. And it feels to me like there's an emerging appreciation for a lot of other kinds of art making.
I hope so. You know, in the very recent past, you know, clay, it was like, well, is it craft? Is it, you know, like you couldn't really figure where you would fit in anything. You know, a craftsperson would probably be horrified at what I do.
And, you know. Well, part of it is, I think, misusing it or not doing it strictly within a particular tradition, right? Yeah. I mean, I think that's what's going on in so many fields right now, even in writing, like breaking genres, or in documentary filmmaking, something that's a hybrid between documentary and feature, acting kind of. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, hopefully it will change for in a good way how, say, art education, art schools work, because everybody's sort of committing to one medium is kind of crazy.
I think even museums are changing this appreciation. Part of it's just budgetary. Like, they can't afford to organize or borrow these blockbuster shows anymore, so they're digging into their collections and finding amazing things that have never really been shown because they were by a woman artist who worked in obscurity doing something, and it didn't seem to relate to anything. And I've seen some really creative shows when curators have had the chance to actually look at a broad range of things and put them on display in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
But I think it feels to me like, I hope so. It's everyone's saying we're not going to go back to normal, but I hope we come out of this and have a broader appreciation of more kinds of things.
But I remember, I think the Craft Museum, which was in a little house next to the Museum of Modern Art, and the shows, they overlap. There was not, although I'm sure that in terms of the curating, there was a very strong line of, art, craft, whatever. But, and then it seems like we've sort of gone backwards since then, and now hopefully going forward into a sort of, a time when there's...
Yeah, MoMA always cared, even from the beginning, about design and things like that. And I've seen them incorporate more of that now and mixing it in interesting ways. So you're not just looking at 8 stellar paintings by Rothko, and you still can do that, of course. But I love stepping out of that room into a room that has a bunch of other things, like a helicopter and a teapot, that kind of thing. There is a change happening, and I think that is disturbing to some people who think that only politics or only art making or only culture should behave a certain way, that hierarchy needs to be honored somehow.
The whole art, the world of museums and everything has evolved in some ways, a lot in the last, 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, but museums do seem to kind of lead the way in terms of what society might be. I mean, they're kind of abstractly exploring kind of the changes that are happening in society.
But hopefully the hierarchy of the curator with sort of one idea is changing.
Yeah. Or the politician with one idea is changing.
But I love the idea that museums and things having to go into their vast storerooms, which must have all sorts of interesting things that,
Yeah, until you're sort of challenged to, if you go to work every day and you get to dream up just about any show you want to, and it's going to be highly competitive with some other institution, if you have to go to work and just say, okay, what can I do with what I've got?
Right.
Which is a way we're all living right now. This whole year has been like that.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Well, I always love those shows. Or I think the New York Times for a while did a series where, an artist would go to a museum and sort of curate their own show or whatever. And I always thought those were
artists
really
find
interesting.
very different things interesting than, curators do. It's truly. But I remember that moment right after the inauguration, right before it, 4 years ago, when we were horrified at what had happened, and we were really trying hard to understand it. But we had this kind of vague sense of optimism, that the courts and the Russian investigation.
Our laws would. Don't worry,
Yeah.
And then Robert Mueller,
it was all going to happen, and we thought already just a month into it, we were going to take care of this problem.
Yeah.
Now here we are, almost in a completely opposite situation where we should feel optimistic, like the tables have turned, and yet I think we're all scared or wary of what is going to happen.
It's not the same, but a little bit in my mind, it's like when Bush, the end of the Bush presidency, and they sort of drove the economy, off a cliff, and they're sort of, the Secretary of Treasury is calling Nancy Pelosi. Well, maybe I better come up right now to talk to you about this, how bad it is. And every day you're thinking like, oh my God, and then you think like, how is anyone going to fix this? You think now, it just seems every day what Biden and Harris have facing them just gets more and more monumental, and
Yeah.
Impossible.
And just the physical threat right now, it's just such a sort of internal resistance movement that we've got going on.
Well, and then we've got a pandemic that's, changing, and, we don't really seem to have a plan to even use the vaccinations we have. So
yeah, it's a very strange moment, because in some ways the light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccinations and a new administration who will be, I think, better at administering. But the virus accelerating, all the explosion of cases, the new strain that's more contagious, and all this.
All right, Kevin, stop.
I'm trying not to use too many H's. Anyway.
It's a very terrifying moment,
Yeah, but it's been a kind of sweet year in a strange way. And just the staying at home has been, I think, beneficial for some of us, and I almost don't like saying that, because I know it's been it's been terrible for other people.
The sort of hunkering down and kind of clarifying or making your choices based on really just on staying alive, kind of.
It's appreciating the basic things.
Just the sort of process of learning to accept whatever crazy thing happens next.
Mary Chatham sculptures were shown last summer at the Pamela Salisbury Gallery in Hudson, New York. More information can be found on Mary's website, marychatham.com.